The night in Lagos came heavy and loud, as if the city itself refused to rest. Sirens echoed through crowded streets, generators hummed outside buildings, and the emergency ward of General Central Hospital was already overflowing before 8 p.m. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered as nurses rushed between stretchers, shouting instructions over the sound of groaning patients. Blood, rainwater, and dust marked the floor as victims of protests, road accidents, and sudden violence filled every corner of the ward. Dr. Tunde Akin stood in the middle of it all, staring at a monitor showing unstable heart rates, his eyes tired but focused. He had already performed 2 emergency surgeries in less than 3 hours, and his hands still trembled slightly beneath his gloves. "We don't have enough beds," a junior nurse called out. Tunde did not respond immediately. He simply nodded as if he had accepted that shortage was now part of life. Across the room, Nurse Ifunanya Okeke moved quickly between patients, cleaning wounds and checking drips with careful hands. Her face looked calm, but her mind was far from the hospital. Inside her pocket was a folded paper she had checked 3 times already that night. It was a warning letter about her immigration status. If she lost her work permit, she would lose everything she had built in Nigeria. She pressed her lips together as she adjusted an oxygen mask on a young man who had been stabbed during a street robbery. The patient grabbed her wrist weakly and whispered, "Am I going to die?" Ifunanya forced a gentle smile and replied, "No, you will be fine, just breathe slowly." But as she said it, she did not fully believe her own words. Near the entrance, Musa Bello stood behind the security desk, watching the chaos with quiet eyes. He was not like the other guards who shouted or tried to control the noise. Musa observed everything, noting who came in and who left. His hand rested on his radio, but he rarely used it. Something about nights like this made him feel uneasy, as if the past was always waiting just outside the door. He looked toward the ambulance bay every few seconds, expecting trouble he could not explain. At 8:45 p.m., the first ambulance arrived with screaming brakes. The doors swung open and paramedics rushed out shouting for help. "Unknown male, unconscious, severe head trauma," they called. The man was pulled out on a stretcher, his body limp and covered with dried blood and dirt. There were no identification papers, no phone, nothing. Dr. Tunde moved immediately, pushing aside exhaustion as he examined the patient. "Prepare CT scan now," he ordered sharply. As the team lifted the man, Tunde noticed something strange. The injuries were not random. They were precise, controlled, almost professional. He frowned slightly but said nothing yet. Ifunanya helped move the patient onto a bed, and as she adjusted the IV line, she paused. The man's wrist had a faint mark, like a coded tattoo or burn scar. She leaned closer, but Musa suddenly appeared at the emergency room doorway. The moment his eyes landed on the unconscious patient, his body froze, his breathing slowed, and his face changed in a way no one noticed except him. For a brief second, he looked like someone who had seen a ghost. Then he quickly turned away. Dr. Tunde noticed Musa's reaction. "Do you know him?" he asked without looking up from the chart. Musa hesitated too long before replying. "No, I don't," he said, but his voice was not steady. Tunde did not press further, but he stored the reaction in his mind. Outside the hospital, rain began to fall harder, turning the streets into shining black rivers. Inside, the generator flickered once, then steadied. The hospital continued its battle against chaos. By 9:30 p.m., rumors began spreading through the staff. Some said the unconscious man looked important. Others said he looked dangerous. Dr. Hassan, the hospital administrator, arrived briefly, his suit too clean for the environment. He said quietly to Tunde, "We must handle this carefully. No leaks, no media. We don't know who this man is." Tunde looked sharply at him. "We are doctors, not politicians," he replied. Hassan did not respond, but his expression showed fear, not disagreement. In another corridor, Ifunanya received a message on her phone. She stepped away from the ward and opened it. Her face went pale. It was from an unknown number. The message read only, "We know where you are. Your file is moving faster than you think." Her hand trembled slightly. She quickly deleted the message, but the fear remained. For a moment, she considered leaving the hospital immediately, but then another patient screamed from inside the ward, pulling her back into duty. Musa walked toward the back exit and called someone using a private phone. His voice was low. "He is here," he said. A pause followed on the other end. Then he added, "Yes, the same one." He ended the call quickly and stared into the rain outside, his jaw tight, as if remembering something painful he had tried to forget for years. At 10:25 p.m., Dr. Tunde completed a quick scan review of the unconscious patient. His expression changed slightly. There was internal bleeding, but also signs of old injuries that had healed improperly. This was not the first time the man had been hurt like this. Tunde leaned back exhausted and whispered to himself, "Who are you?" The monitor beside him beeped steadily, as if refusing to answer. Then everything shifted. A sudden commotion came from outside. Musa rushed toward the entrance, his hand already on his radio. Through the glass doors, he saw a black SUV stop slowly in front of the hospital. Another vehicle followed, then another. The engines did not stop immediately, as if they were waiting. Musa narrowed his eyes. The back doors of one SUV opened slightly, and he saw men sitting inside, watching the hospital without moving. Inside the emergency ward, Dr. Tunde felt a strange pressure in the air, as if something dangerous had just arrived. Nurse Ifunanya looked up from her patient, sensing it too. Musa stepped back into the building slowly and whispered under his breath, "They found him." Outside, one of the men finally stepped out of the SUV, holding something hidden under his jacket as he stared directly at the hospital entrance. The rain over Lagos grew heavier as the night deepened, turning the hospital grounds into a blur of headlights, wet concrete, and restless shadows. Inside the emergency ward, the chaos had not slowed, but something in the air had changed. Dr. Tunde Akin felt it first, a quiet pressure behind his thoughts that made every sound feel sharper than before. He stood near the unconscious patient, now officially labeled John Doe, watching the monitor as the man's vitals shifted unpredictably. Nurse Ifunanya moved past him, but her usual calm was thinner now, as if something was slowly wearing her down. Musa's warning about the black SUVs had not been spoken aloud to everyone, but it had already spread through silence, through glances, through the way people moved more cautiously than before. At 10:30 p.m., police officers entered the hospital with fast, controlled steps. Inspector Chike led them, his eyes scanning everything without pause. "Where is the unidentified patient?" he asked immediately, his voice firm but not loud. Dr. Hassan appeared beside him almost instantly, smiling too carefully. "Inspector, we are handling the case internally. The patient is critical and cannot be disturbed." Chike ignored him and looked directly at Dr. Tunde. "Doctor, I need to see him." Tunde hesitated for a moment, then replied, "He is alive but unstable. Any disruption could kill him." Chike nodded slowly, as if accepting the warning but not trusting it. Behind them, Musa watched every movement, his jaw tight, his eyes slightly unfocused, as if the past was pressing against his memory. In another part of the ward, Nurse Ifunanya received another message on her phone. Her hand shook slightly as she read it. This time it was longer. "You should have left when you had the chance. Your work permit is already under review. One more complaint and you will be removed." She swallowed hard and locked her phone immediately. For a moment she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. She thought about her life before Lagos, about the hope she had carried when she first came here to work in hospitals, believing skill and kindness would be enough to protect her. Now, in the middle of noise, blood, and flashing lights, she felt something colder than exhaustion, fear that had no clear shape. At 10:50 p.m., Dr. Tunde finally received clearance to move John Doe for a more detailed scan. As the patient was wheeled through the corridor, Tunde noticed something tucked inside the man's clothing that had not been there before. It was a small, sealed plastic card, partially hidden near his waist. He carefully removed it while no one was looking and slipped it into his pocket. He did not open it yet, but his instincts told him it was important, very important. Meanwhile, Inspector Chike made a quiet phone call in the hallway. His voice dropped as he spoke. "Yes, I have seen him. No, he is still unconscious. I don't care what they want, the hospital is not releasing him yet." He paused, listening. "If this goes wrong, it will not be my fault." He ended the call and looked back toward the ward, his expression darker now. Outside, the black SUVs remained parked, their engines off, but their presence heavy. Musa stepped closer to the glass doors, watching the men inside. One of them finally got out and stood under the rain, staring directly at the hospital entrance. Musa's breathing slowed. He knew that face, or at least he thought he did. It looked like someone from a time he had buried deep in his memory, a time he never spoke about. His hand tightened around his radio, but he did not call for backup. Inside, Dr. Tunde began reviewing the scan results when the hospital generator flickered violently. Light dimmed for a second, then returned. In that brief darkness, John Doe's hand moved slightly. Nurse Ifunanya noticed it first. "Doctor," she said quickly, stepping closer. He moved. Tunde turned sharply. The patient's fingers twitched again, then stopped. The heart monitor beeped irregularly, then stabilized. Tunde leaned in closer, his face tense. He should not be responding like this. Not yet. As if responding to his words, John Doe's eyes suddenly opened halfway. The room froze. Dr. Tunde stared at him, unable to speak. Nurse Ifunanya stepped back instinctively, her breath caught in her throat. Musa from the doorway went completely still. The patient's lips moved slightly, struggling to form words. A weak voice escaped him, broken but urgent. "They are inside," he whispered. Then his body tensed violently and the monitor screamed as his condition collapsed again. Alarms filled the ward. Nurses rushed in. "We are losing him," someone shouted. Tunde snapped back into action, pushing fear aside. "Prepare adrenaline now," he ordered sharply. Ifunanya grabbed equipment with shaking hands. Musa stepped forward unconsciously, then stopped himself as if remembering where he was. But in the chaos, no one noticed the small change that had just happened. The plastic card Tunde had taken from the patient's clothing was no longer in his pocket. By 11:30 p.m., police tension increased. Inspector Chike demanded full access to the patient's records, but hospital administration delayed him. Dr. Hassan insisted on controlling the situation, saying, "We cannot allow external interference." Chike leaned closer to him and said quietly, "This is not just a hospital case anymore. You don't understand what you are protecting." Hassan's expression stiffened, but he did not respond. In a quiet corridor, Musa entered a restricted storage room alone. He closed the door behind him and stood in darkness for a moment. Then he opened a small metal box hidden under a shelf and stared inside. Inside was an old photograph. He picked it up slowly, his face tightened with emotion he had buried for years. "I really is him," he whispered. His voice was almost broken. "After all this time." At midnight, the hospital lights flickered again, stronger this time. The generator struggled. Outside, one of the SUVs finally turned off its headlights. Inside, Dr. Tunde looked at the empty space where the plastic card had been seen earlier. His expression slowly changed from confusion to realization. Someone inside the hospital had taken it. And then, from the hallway, a security camera light blinked off.
Midnight settled over Lagos like a heavy cover, but inside the hospital emergency ward, there was no sense of night or rest. Everything was noise, motion, and tension stretched too thin. The flickering lights above the corridor made shadows jump along the walls, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Dr. Tunde Akin stood near the unconscious patient again, his face more tired than before, his eyes carrying the weight of too many unanswered questions. John Doe lay still, but the memory of his brief awakening refused to leave the room. Nurse Ifunanya moved between patients mechanically now, her earlier calm replaced by quiet fear she tried to hide behind professional movements. Musa had not returned to his usual post, and that alone made the hospital feel less secure. Outside the emergency ward, the black SUVs remained like silent watchers in the rain, their presence unchanged but more threatening as time passed. Inside, Inspector Chike paced near the nurse's station, speaking in low tones to his team. "We are not leaving without answers," he said firmly. Dr. Hassan stood nearby, trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. "Inspector, this is still a medical facility. You cannot turn it into an interrogation ground," he said. Chike turned to him sharply. "Then stop hiding things from me. This patient is connected to something bigger than you understand." Neither of them noticed the way hospital staff were beginning to avoid eye contact, as if everyone suspected everyone else. In a quiet corner of the ward, Nurse Ifunanya checked her phone again, though she already knew what she would find. Another message appeared, shorter this time. "Final warning. Leave or we will make your situation public." Her fingers tightened around the phone until it hurt. She looked toward the emergency beds where patients cried out in pain, where Dr. Tunde moved like a man refusing to collapse, and where machines beeped like fragile lifelines. She whispered to herself, "I cannot leave now," but the words felt uncertain even as she said them. She slipped the phone into her pocket and returned to duty, but her eyes no longer held the same steadiness. At 12:20 a.m., the power flickered again, but this time it did not fully recover. The generator struggled and parts of the hospital dimmed into partial darkness. Emergency light activated, casting a red glow across the corridors. In that uneasy light, movement outside the emergency ward suddenly increased. Musa finally reappeared, breathing slightly heavier than usual, his eyes sharper and more alert than before. Dr. Tunde noticed him immediately. "Where have you been?" he asked quickly. Musa hesitated before replying. "Checking the perimeter," he said, but his voice lacked his usual calm certainty. Tunde studied him for a moment longer, but had no time to question further as a nurse rushed in shouting that John Doe's condition had dropped again. Inside the emergency room, John Doe's heart monitor began to fluctuate violently. Dr. Tunde rushed in, snapping back into full focus. "What happened?" he demanded. Nurse Ifunanya replied quickly. His oxygen levels dropped suddenly, no warning. Tunde moved closer, checking the patient's pupils, pulse and breathing. Then something unusual happened again. John Doe's fingers twitched once, then slowly curled into a weak fist. His lips moved slightly, as if trying to form words. The monitor beeped irregularly, and the room felt tighter, as if the air itself had become heavier. Then, in a low, broken whisper, John Doe spoke again, clearer this time, but still weak. "Inside, one of you," he said, before coughing sharply. Dr. Tunde leaned closer instantly. "Who is inside?" he asked urgently. But before the patient could respond, his body jerked violently, and the monitor screamed into alarm again. The sound filled the entire ward, pulling every staff member into panic. "We are losing him," someone shouted. Nurse Ifunanya grabbed emergency equipment, her hands shaking slightly, but still moving. Musa appeared at the doorway, watching silently, his face unreadable. As chaos spread around the bed, Dr. Tunde struggled to stabilize the patient. "Stay with me," he said firmly, pressing down urgency in his voice. "Do not die now." But John Doe's condition dropped again, slipping further away from stability. Then, suddenly, all monitors froze for half a second, as if something had interfered with them. In that brief silence, a strange realization hit Tunde. The plastic card he had taken, earlier, the one that disappeared, was not just missing. Someone had taken it on purpose, and whoever did knew exactly what it contained. Outside the room, Musa stood completely still. His eyes were locked on John Doe, but his thoughts were somewhere else, somewhere far darker. He slowly stepped away from the doorway and walked down a dim corridor, his footsteps quiet but heavy with memory. He stopped near a maintenance door and opened it slowly. Inside was a small storage area filled with old hospital files and broken equipment. Musa closed the door behind him and stood in silence for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the old photograph again. His hand trembled slightly as he stared at it. "You were supposed to be gone," he whispered, his voice filled with conflict. "They said you were dead." Back in the emergency ward, Inspector Chike received a call. He answered immediately, turning away from the crowd. "Yes," he said quietly. He listened for a long moment, then his expression hardened. "No one moves him yet," he said. "I don't care what orders they are giving. Something is wrong here." He ended the call and looked toward Dr. Tunde with a new intensity, as if he now trusted even fewer people than before. At 1 a.m., the hospital cameras flickered again, and this time, one of them shut down completely. In a hidden corridor above the emergency ward, a shadow moved quickly along the wall, unseen by most. Down below, Dr. Tunde finally noticed something disturbing. A second set of footsteps had passed near the emergency room earlier, but no one had reported it. He turned slowly, scanning the ward, realizing for the first time that the danger outside might already be inside. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, a security alert suddenly went off as another camera feed cut to black. At 3:30 a.m., the emergency ward doors finally gave way. The sound of forced entry cut through the hospital like a blade, and armed men in dark clothing moved in with controlled precision. The rain outside followed them in through the broken entrance, mixing with the harsh red glow of emergency lights inside. Dr. Tunde Akin stood between the patient and the corridor, his body tense but steady, while Nurse Ifunanya instinctively moved closer to the bed, as if protecting it with her presence alone. Inspector Chike reached for his weapon but stopped when he saw the number of men entering. Musa stood slightly behind them, his face now fully exposed to the past he had been trying to avoid. The leader of the armed group stepped forward and spoke calmly. "We don't want trouble. We want him." John Doe lay weakly on the bed, his breathing unstable but conscious. His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw the men, something in his expression changed from confusion to painful recognition. Dr. Tunde demanded sharply, "Who is he?" But no one answered him immediately. Instead, John Doe spoke in a cracked voice. "Too late. It already left the building." Those words made one of the armed men glance at his phone, his expression tightening. Inspector Chike stepped forward angrily. "This is a hospital, not your battlefield." The leader ignored him and instead looked directly at Musa, saying quietly, "You were supposed to make sure he never reached here." The room fell into stunned silence. Musa's breathing changed, and for the first time, his composure completely broke. He whispered, "I didn't know they would come for him inside a hospital." Dr. Tunde turned toward him sharply, realizing then that Musa's connection was deeper than anyone had understood. John Doe coughed violently, then forced out more words. He saw what they buried, the convoy, the names, the senator. Before he could finish, his condition worsened again, but the meaning was already clear enough. This was not a random patient. He was a witness, a carrier of evidence against powerful political and criminal figures. Suddenly, Nurse Ifunanya stepped back as she realized something hidden in the patient's IV bag. A small sealed memory chip had been concealed within the medical tubing, likely placed there before arrival. She looked at Dr. Tunde and said urgently, "This is what they are looking for." Tunde took it carefully, understanding instantly that this was the missing piece of evidence. Musa looked at it and whispered, "If they get that, everything is erased." Outside, more vehicles arrived. The situation was no longer just hospital-based. It had become something larger, more dangerous, involving state power and organized crime working together. Inspector Chike lowered his voice and said, "If this goes public, there will be no protection for anyone here." Dr. Tunde looked at John Doe, then at the chip in his hand, and made a decision that surprised even himself. "We are not giving them anything," he said firmly. Nurse Ifunanya stepped closer and added quietly, "Then we all become part of this story." John Doe's breathing slowed further, and he looked at Dr. Tunde one last time. "Truth is not safe," he whispered, before his eyes slowly closed again. The heart monitor beeped steadily, then flatlined with final silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dr. Tunde lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding. Outside, the armed men hesitated, receiving sudden instructions through their radios. Then, unexpectedly, they began to withdraw. The leader gave one last look into the ward and said, "This is not finished," and then they were gone, disappearing back into the rain as quickly as they had arrived. Inspector Chike turned away slowly, already receiving urgent calls that confirmed what John Doe had hinted at. A political cover-up had been exposed, and damage control was already beginning at higher levels. Musa stood quietly, staring at the floor, knowing his past had finally caught up with him. Nurse Ifunanya looked at Dr. Tunde and said softly,
What happens now? Tunde looked at the chip in his hand, then at the lifeless body of John Doe, and replied, now we decide what kind of people we are when no one is watching. By sunrise, the hospital returned to its normal chaos, but nothing inside it was the same anymore. John Doe was officially recorded as unidentified and deceased, but the truth he carried had already escaped the building. Dr. Tunde remained in silence longer than usual after his shift. Nurse Ifunanya later received notice that her immigration case had been unexpectedly suspended, not resolved, just paused. Musa disappeared before morning reports were filed, leaving behind only a name that no longer protected him. And the hospital itself continued to function, as all places of crisis do, as if nothing had happened, even though everything had changed. The moral of the night was simple but heavy. In a world where power hides behind silence, doing the right thing often costs more than people are willing to pay, but silence always costs more in the end.